When the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November 1989, the world watched as the Iron Curtain came down across Europe, as did communism in Eastern and Central Europe. Seeing those Germans stood on top of the wall in front of the Brandenburg Gate was seen as a huge moment in history, with the people split for so long, finally allowed to cross from east to west and so on. Shortly after the fall of the wall, the Cold War came to an end, and it was a time of much unease for millions across the world, but the crowds crossing is seen today as a symbol of liberty. However, over the years there were a significant number of people who were murdered and killed whilst trying to cross the Berlin Wall, and most of them wished to head for West Germany, leaving the East in the Soviet areas. During the time that the wall stood, over 100,000 people wanted to escape and attempted to, and only 5,000 were successful, but it's been estimated that up to 200 were killed in and around Berlin attempting to cross. Today we look at one of the saddest killings of the Berlin Wall, a young German bricklayer whose death had a significant effect on those inside of Berlin. Today we look at the brutal killing of Peter Fechter, the victim of the Berlin Wall. And remember, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Peter Fechter was born on the 14th of January 1944, inside the final moments of the Second World War and Hitler's Third Reich. He was born in Berlin as the war was turning against the Germans, but within months the city would fall into the hands of the Soviets as a savage Battle of Berlin erupted. The fighting around the city was hellish and brutal, and the Soviets were known in Berlin for killing civilians, so the fact the few months old Peter survived was a good thing. Little is known about how he did this. However, he was raised in a district of Berlin known as the Weißensee district, and his father was an engineer and his mother worked in sales. Little is known about his early life, but we can work out that he was educated in the years that Berlin was carved up into the occupation zones, and that his education would have been dominated and influenced because of this. Weißensee was found in the Soviet occupation zone of Berlin when the city was divided, and this later became known as East Berlin, found within East Germany. The Fechter family were divided, as Peter's sister lived in the west where she had married, and she was visited by her family often, but when the construction of the Berlin Wall began, and the East German government closed the border, this split the family in two. They were no longer allowed to travel to West Berlin to see his sister. At the age of 14, Peter Fechter left school and began his training working as an apprentice bricklayer. He met a friend here named Helmut Kuhlbeck, and together they worked at different sites around Berlin on construction projects, continuing to rebuild the city after the effects of the Second World War. Whilst the city was being repaired, the Berlin Wall was also being constructed, and Peter understood a big political divide inside of the city, between communism in the east and capitalism in the west, influenced by the different countries who controlled the different parts. Peter had family in the west, and the thought that he would never see them again was enough for him to contemplate defecting from east to west. Together the young men came up with an escape plan, a plan that would see them leaving the oppressive east and heading towards a more prosperous west. They began to come up with some sort of plan, however this was never concrete, and together they began to explore the border region to consider how they could head over to the west without fear of death. They had been thinking of fleeing for a long time, but they did not make any specific preparations on how to breach the border. They had discussed together the need to flee, and they knew that life would be better for them in the west. A file uncovered in the Stasi archive stated how Peter Fechter's company had denied him a trip to West Germany in the past, and this may have forced his hand to try and flee. Now, whilst walking through the city of Berlin, Helmut and Peter noticed a dilapidated and damaged building on Schützenstrasse that once housed a carpentry workshop. The back windows faced Zimmerstrasse and went up almost to the wall. During a lunch break they agreed to leave the construction site and go and investigate the building, which they believed could protect them and help them head for freedom. The wall had stood for around a year on the 17th of August 1962, when Fechter and Kuhlbeck attempted to escape East Germany. The plan was to hide in the carpenter's workshop near to the wall, and to keep an eye on the border guards, and to then jump out of the window into the death strip whilst they were not looking. The Berlin Wall was actually two walls, and in between was an area of land known as a death strip, a bit of land that was up to 160 yards wide, that contained sand, anti-vehicle trenches, watchtowers, guard dogs, floodlights and even tripwire machine guns. It was a buffer zone and a no man's land, but to be caught inside was deadly, with guards shooting anyone who was trying to escape. The plan was to run across it and to climb over the 2-metre tall wall topped with barbed wire near to checkpoint Charlie. Holed up inside the carpentry workshop, the two found a window in a storage room that wasn't bricked up, but they heard voices coming and they thought they'd been discovered. They jumped out of the window having taken off their shoes, and they ran from one side of the wall across a death strip. It was a race against time. The plan was initially successful as both of the men reached the final wall. However, as they began to climb the final obstacle, East German border guards opened fire on them. Helmut succeeded in crossing the wall, but when this happened, Fechter froze and was hit in the pelvis by a bullet. Helmut later stated, "I had reached the wall by then, jumped up and forced myself through the barbed wire on top of the wall. I don't know why Peter didn't climb up. He should have been at the wall before me. He didn't say anything, and I had that feeling when the shots were fired that he was in a state of shock. I called out loudly to him, but he didn't move." 4 border guards fired 35 shots at the two. Fechter, as he was hit, fell backwards against a wall for support. He fell back onto the death strip, onto the East German side, in front of hundreds of witnesses. He was hit and was screaming, with his shouts piercing for help, but he was simply just left. In front of hundreds, Peter Fechter slowly died from his injuries, and no medical help came from the East German side, and he could not be helped by the West Germans. West Berlin threw him bandages which did not reach him, and Fechter slowly bled to death over the course of an hour. The angry crowds then gathered in West Berlin, outraged by what they saw, meeting the border guards and accusing them of being murderers. The lack of medical help was what outraged the crowds and the world, as photographers caught the whole events, and the pictures were seen around the world. It was seen as horrific, the young 18-year-old boy who wished for a better life, bleeding out when his life could have been possibly saved. The East later admitted that mistakes were made, and it was said that the injured Fechter should have been removed from the border grounds, but reports stated that the damage could have been done by the shot to Fechter, causing him serious injury, of which he may never have recovered from. Later in 1997, after the reunification of Germany, 35 years after Fechter's death, 2 former guards were placed on trial for manslaughter and were convicted. It wasn't clear who fired the fatal bullet, but the killing of Peter Fechter showed all of those people around the world what the situation inside Berlin was like. The wall was referred to as a wall of shame, and Fechter's life was just one of those hundreds which were taken as desperate people tried to cross to the West to flee the oppression they may have been suffering. The West was seen as a haven for so many in the East, and the killing of Peter Fechter was one of possibly over 200 which occurred. Some came up with more elaborate plans, and some were killed in different ways, but the state of Berlin and politics at the time restricted the freedom so much for those Berliners living in the city. Peter Fechter's killing was incredibly shocking, and he's remembered today as a victim of the Berlin Wall. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.